Welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to those who are on Zoom and being patient with those of us who are coming from the sanctuary and grabbing some lunch. But I just want to thank everybody who is here for the presentation. It really means a lot to me and to our community, and we thank those who will watch the recording later. Before I get too in depth with what we are going to get into today, of course, if you just stumble upon in here onto this Zoom link or lunch, this is a presentation about my Doctorate of Ministry project entitled Reimagining Christian Mission, Developing Postcolonial Practices of Mission in a Congregational Setting. If you think that is a lot of words, well, then I'd be glad to let you read the 100-some pages of writing and data and reports that those words turned into, and some of your words are in. So we'll dive into a little bit of what that means in just a moment. But before I go any further, I did want to be sure to say thank you to a lot of different people. I want to say thank you to those here at Sardis, from the staff, who many of the different staff helped in a variety of ways. Our mission ministry have been huge conversation partners and supporters of this project. Many of you participated at least in, as a participant in a mission event, maybe filled out some surveys. Some of you participated in focus groups. So just thank you so much. And even just those who remembered that I was still slugging along with all of this work and asked about how it was going and have been encouragers. Thank you so much. And also several folks from our community who were proofreaders of my paper. That was no small ask and no small task for them, given the length of this project. So an immense amount of gratitude for those folks who know who they are. I also want to thank the professors who were readers and conversation partners and teachers along this path for me, and also the colleagues of mine who were conversation partners and mentors as I did my practicum part of this degree. And then I just can't thank enough just all the other people in my life, all of my ministry colleagues, all of my friends, my family members, and just the many different people and partners in mission that I have encountered my whole life long, that I realized as I started to put these things into writing, how many different people and places and interact. Thank you to everyone. All right, so before I get into some of the key terms, titles, all the details about my project, I wanted to tell you a story that is a portion of what has led to this project. And wonder with me, what can laundry teach us about Christian mission? So many years ago, I was traveling back to the country of Ghana to live there with Presbyterian pastors and their churches. And I was on a long car ride with a Peace USA mission coworker who has lived in West Africa for many, many years. And as we talked along this long journey, I remember him telling me this story. And he told me a story about a congregation from the United States who had had some interactions with and visited churches and places in Ghana. And they wanted to do something to be a part of supporting the communities there. And they had visited a hospital that was in Ghana. And they noticed that this particular health clinic or hospital, that there were no washers or dryers, electric washers or dryers, for the linens from the hospital beds to be washed. And these folks thought, well, we must have some way to properly sanitize all these linens who will then be washed and reused for other patients. Now, this story took place many years ago, so even Reverend Joshua couldn't remember all of the details, but he remembers this very clearly, this coming about. And there were some conversations between the Ghanaian community and the US congregation, and most of those details have kind of slipped a little bit back into history. But what ended up happening is the US congregation raised money to hopefully put washers and dryers in this hospital. Well, along this journey of fundraising and whatnot, they discovered that should they put the industrial size washers and dryers that we might find in the hospitals here in the US, or even in maybe some of the bigger cities in Ghana, if we were to put those in there, the rest of the town would probably not be able to have their electricity if those were running. Okay, so plan B. Then they thought about, well, can we get washers and dryers like some of us have in our homes and use those there? Perhaps maybe overlooking the fact that those washers and dryers do not sanitize laundry like the industrial strength types of ones do. So the story unfolds. I think at least a structure was built to house these washers and dryers, but nobody really knows if the washers and dryers really ever made it there, or if they did, what happened to them. And he told me this story, and no mention of the word post-colonialism or anything like that, but I remember that he said to me, so when you get there with your hosts, these families you will be living with, he said, let them teach you something. Let them show you how they do laundry. Let them show you how they cook their dishes and live their life. And I don't remember if there was any more conversation specifically about that, but I do know that in my suitcase that I had overly packed for this trip, that I never once then went in there and got that US-made laundry soap that I had brought with me, because I was uncertain of what I was going to be encountering whenever I needed to wash my clothes. So you can see this picture here of me and Janet, one of the elders at the church, doing our laundry together, finding much amusement in teaching me her way of doing laundry. And you can get a little peek in this photo of my laundry drying in the midst of all the choir robes outside the church and in between where the pastor's family and I were staying. And so I tell you this story not because we only need to think about these kinds of things when we interact with people of a different place or a different culture, but that these kinds of ways of thinking that I've discovered in what we now name colonialism still get embedded in our brains. So I've discovered, even in my own, this way of thinking that perhaps my way must be the way that everyone else should do it, that my way must be the better way, even if your way is fine. And Joshua explained to me that, maybe they did have some conversations, but perhaps there was not a check on the power dynamics that took place in those relationships that could have allowed people on one side to say, that's an interesting idea, but the way we are doing our laundry is just fine. And in fact, when you put your laundry in the very hot sun here in Ghana, it gets dry pretty fast, and I'm sure it is fairly sanitized as well, given the good gifts from God that we were given. So it just is a story that has always stuck with me, and I think has carried with me along this journey that I've been on, for sure, of exploring then what is Christian mission and how do we do that in partnership and relationship with people in a way that is aware of our history, of where we've come from, and then where we feel like and hope that God is calling us to go in the future. And so again, I want to share that story, not because that's something we only need to think about when we might go on a mission trip or somewhere else, but things that we should think about here, wherever our local context is. And so whenever I started thinking about this project and mission, I started asking questions of myself and of the world around us. I started wondering if mission only puts Band-Aids on a broken bone, if mission is done with good intentions, but it ends up causing harm, if mission leaves some dependent or perceivably inferior to others, if mission does not address the root causes of what is causing the suffering, if mission does not model Christ through humility, through building community, can we call it Christian mission? And I'll leave that as a question mark for us right now. So I entered into this doctoral research, and the purpose of my research that I stated was two parts. One was to examine how colonialism and that, not only that time period and the ways in which people acted, but how those ways of thinking continue to affect how we practice Christian mission today. And then also, the second was to examine if some kind of congregation-wide mission event that incorporated elements such as worship and education, relationship building, some hands-on mission and service, and also reflection, could something like that lead a congregation towards embodying a post-colonial mission theology? So the research did not set out to prove, can one event or one moment change everything or transform everything in one moment, but it did set out to explore how it might shape the journey ahead. So I'm going to run through a few details so you kind of get on board with the whole journey, but I'm going to go through them kind of quickly, but also stop along the way for questions and things like that. So I'm going to go quicker in the things that I think are a little less important so that I have more time to have conversation with you about the bigger pieces. So the whole scope of the Doctorate of Ministry project involves coursework, it involves studying research methods, it involved a practicum project, which is I did here at Sardis. There were some worship services and sermons and a book study and a few mission opportunities. There were maybe March 2021 that I implemented as a part of my practicum project. I reviewed a long list of books and articles and reflected on them and did some write-ups on them. We had to engage in some project proposal with the professors and things like that at the school and build up our framework for the project. And then came time to conduct the actual research. It's a little strange to be looking out at you all and say, well, you all were some of my research subjects. That's not how I thought about it. But we did this research together. And after all of that, then a paper was written and then culminating today in this presentation. So the methods and the research that I did really focused on an event that we had at Sardis back in January that we called Sardis Serves Together. And that was a day of worship and lunch and learning alongside of Families Forward Charlotte, who's one of our local mission partners. So many of you, I think, were there and can remember that day. So in regards to that day, those who participated, who were at least 18 years or older, were invited to fill out a survey before and then right after. And then a few months later, I asked you to reflect a little bit more just as time had passed. What you may not have known is that I also had conversations with two different focus groups. One of those groups was a group of our leaders in the mission ministry team or committee, people who are actively serving on, making decisions on how the church is participating in mission right now. And then the other group was a sampling of the congregation that I purposely chose so that there was a range of ages and backgrounds and what have you. And then there were some church documents related to mission and whatnot that I looked at. So, and I'll give you a brief overview of this because it became very important for me, and we were encouraged to consider our context as we went about this research. It's not just about diving in the books and then doing some research and then saying, here we are, done with it. So I just want to point out a few things that I found to be meaningful and important about our context doing this research here. So the most local context for us would be Sardis Presbyterian Church, who's been around for hundreds of years, since 1790. Some interesting things about Sardis are that we contribute at least 10% of our annual church budget to mission. And that last year alone, beyond that in the annual budget, there was over $65,000 given towards different mission efforts, whether that be the special collections, different things that we do, like Book of My Own, or generating funds for Haiti, our partners, or whatever that is. We're sitting in right now the Sardis house that I dug up a little bit of history to learn a little bit more on. The Sardis house that was constructed back in 2011 that we're in primarily was constructed as the Sardis Mission House. And here today we still welcome our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness during the winter months and participate in the Room in the Inn program that's around Charlotte. So that was one of the reasons why this building was built. So that to me says this is an important part of our context and who we are. We have a host of different international and local partners. We have a history of bringing the church together for church-wide mission events. And then interesting that we were asked across all of our ministries this year to calculate how many volunteer hours does it take, or are you contributing towards your particular ministry area? All of us did this. Well, the mission hours, I mean, this is probably a low estimate. We tried very hard, but we estimated at least over 11,000 different volunteer hours just in 1 year that we're contributing towards all of what we might label as mission through Sardis, whether that be our folks out in the community or events here. And again, that's probably just a very low estimate. The other part of our, if we zoom out just a little bit, part of our context is us being in Charlotte. And just a few things I'll point out for you here is that almost 10 years ago, there was a study done, and Charlotte ranked 50 of the 50 largest cities in the US for economic and social mobility, meaning that we rank the lowest, the worst in those cities in terms of if you're born in poverty, you're probably going to stay in poverty. And you can see in this map of the city that Charlotte is pretty, the areas of Charlotte where people live are pretty well condensed based on your economic level. So the areas of darker here in the south and then in the north are have more people who have a higher economic status, and then the stuff in the middle is more often people are at a lower economic status. And so that's important in our context just as a city, but then also the fact that right in here in this, what we call the southern wedge of Charlotte, that's where we are at Sardis. That's where our church is physically located. And in addition to the economic demographic, that also stands fairly true for race and ethnicity. So the majority of people living in the southern wedge of Charlotte and then in the north where the higher economic statuses are white. And then the darker shaded areas, you see there's more prominence of people who are not white. And so what this told me is that, well, given where we are, literally where we are, we could choose to just interact with people who are fairly similar to us. And I guess a lot of people, no matter where they are, could choose to just interact with people who are more similar to us than different. It's the fact that we have this choice, do we stay in our bubble or not? And also the fact that we are kind of divided like this affects our context of mission. And then one of our larger contexts of mission is that we are a Peace USA congregation. So just a couple things I'll point out about that. One is that many years ago, the Peace USA changed their terms for missionaries, which is a term we often might hear or think of. We changed to calling the people that go from somewhere in the US to living and working in another country on behalf of the church, we call them mission co-workers instead of missionaries. And that is to not only imply, but to live out that we are partners and co-workers with whomever we are working with. The Peace USA is not sending my friend Reverend Joshua to West Africa to do the work. God is calling and sending him, but the people in which he works with there who are from Ghana, they are his co-workers and they are doing work together. Sometimes he is supporting work that began among them and not among him. And then there's also been a newer initiative in the Peace USA called the Matthew 25 initiative. And there are some big pieces of that, including eradicating systemic poverty and dismantling structural racism. And that's kind of some big talk, but it's an invitation based in scripture from our denomination to say, we are challenged to rethink and reform how we do things, because we see that there are such big struggles and sufferings in the world that one small thing will not change. But we need to reimagine how we're engaging as the church in this world so that we are pointing to this larger reality where God welcomes all people at the table. So I won't say anything more about that, but I'll jump to the largest scale of the context that I zoomed to for my project. And that's our US and then global context. So here in the US, some cultural context things that I have found in my research that have influenced us are just the trends of individualism, materialism, something called the experience economy, which I'll get to in just a moment. But then we also live in this world of globalization. It's a lot easier now than it was, 1,000 years ago, to travel to different places. We have a lot more connection via technology. We can look up on the news or something and see something going on in another, or we can even communicate with each other in a way that we couldn't 100 years ago. So that influences how we do mission. Here in the US, there is a trend, or has been, that almost 2 million Americans have participated in something called a short-term mission project. That's something, or a trip. That's anything that lasts from 14 days or less. It's a huge trend, and you can see how much money we spend on that. $3 to $5 billion in a year. That's a lot of money. And we might see that in a local context too, of the trend of more one-time service projects as well. But meanwhile, Christianity is growing in different ways in different places, and I'll let you in on a little secret. We're not the leaders in terms of the growth in numbers of Christianity. Christianity is growing a lot faster, or perhaps growing versus declining, in the global south. So South America, Africa, and other continents like that. And another secret I'll let you in on is that after a lot of the colonizing powers and countries left and finally relinquished, maybe not all of their control, but most of it, Christianity started to grow more in those places, the studies have shown. So it's just kind of interesting. But this map shows you the center of gravity of Christianity, and you can see that, of course, when we begin with Christianity with Jesus, it all kind of gravitates towards that place where it started. But then as the church branches out, if you took the average or whatever and put a point on the map of where the most Christians are everywhere and figured out where that point would center, you can see how the trend kind of moved towards Europe and the United States, but has dramatically swung back and is already the center of gravity within the continent of Africa, and swinging further south and further back towards the other way. So some perspective and context that I found to be important when we think about Christian mission. So I want to give you just a brief moment to take a breath and take some of that in. And I want you to consider, given all of these contexts, locally, nationally, globally, what is one thing you wonder about and related to Christian mission? And if you're online, I welcome you to put that question in the chat, or if you're here in person, I invite you to share around your table for just a moment or write it on one of the cards on your table. A few points I'm going to stop along the way to collect questions. That way I can kind of siphon through them and see what we might need to voice now and what we might need to voice later. So let me give you just a minute. Go ahead. Turn to those at your table. What is one question that you wonder about related to Christian mission? And if you'd like to write it down, you're more than welcome to. So if you heard some thought-provoking questions at your table, I would love if even one person wanted to write down a couple of those on a card so I can collect those, maybe address them in a moment, or at least take them as food for thought for the road. Anybody want to share a question that this context in which we live in makes you wonder about? Cody? Okay.
How can we make sure that our efforts for dollars reach the proposed or intended recipients?
Okay, so how can we make sure that our efforts and dollars reach the intended recipients?
Along the same line of how we Washington.
Ah, thank you. Any other questions that you all wondered about? Yeah.
Just kind of about how we know that, like, especially like the one-shot things, whether that actually made a difference.
Especially one-time things. How do we know if it actually made a difference? That's a great question. Yeah. Yes.
When are you going to welcome mission co-workers in South America and Africa? And I don't mean that with you.
Meaning here at Sardis or here in, when are we, Nancy asked, when are we going to welcome mission coworkers who are in South America or Africa? When are we going to welcome them
Into our congregation.
into our congregation? That's a great question.
To refresh our
Yeah, to refresh us, to learn from them. Yeah. I had a lot of really great experiences being in Decatur next to one of the mission havens where a lot of the mission coworkers would come to stay when they were coming for their reprieves in the US, and would long for some connections like that here because it changes us and it shapes us and refreshes us. So please do write down those other questions, and my trusty assistant over here is going to write down the ones that are coming from Zoom. So I'll send you maybe around the room too if anybody else wants to give you your cards, and I'll collect them in just a moment. All right, so now I want to move into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty pieces that made up the framework for my project and research. There are a few key terms that I'll go over in just a moment that became part of the framework for helping me understand at least Christian mission. I went to look for biblical perspectives of mission. I looked at the history of Christian mission, looked at some of the current influences on Christian mission, and then also dug into something that I'll get into more in just a moment, postcolonial theology and postcolonial mission. So I thought I would start there because those are two big words that I've already thrown around a lot, and I wanted you to get a summary of what at least I am meaning when I say those words. So when I talk about colonialism, this is referring to the time period roughly about the 4th through 19th centuries, in which we have Western countries and powers going to other countries and colonizing other people and lands by force. They asserted control. They did things that ended up fostering dependency. A lot of times we hear, given the writings that we can look back on, that there was assumptions made that some were knowledgeable, some were the holy givers who had something that other people needed and that others needed to receive. And you hear a lot of language from way back in the day about how others were perceived as heathens, so unholy, and in need of whatever it was that the colonizers were bringing. So there are a lot of beliefs that colonizers took with them, including missionaries, that they had this divine power given to them, and this clear picture of what God's blueprint for society was. And it got embedded not only just in the ways that people acted, but also the ways that people were thinking and seeing one another. And it affected everything from the borders of current day countries to the use of natural resources, even who controls some of those natural resources today. It affected religion, leadership, economics, all sorts of different things. Now, I always give the caveat when I talk about colonialism that a lot of good stuff happened too, right? Not everybody just completely destroyed and decimated people. No, that did happen. There were some good things that happened as people moved across different borders related to healthcare and hospitals, education, all sorts of different things, infrastructure. But even when some of those good things were happening, that still continue today, there were often some deadly costs to that. So then when we flip that on ahead, we get a concept now called postcolonial theology. And this is a realm of thinking about God and our study of God that questions these structures of power that are embedded in the way in which we have been socialized. And so postcolonial theology seeks to recognize this and then also work to validate the perspectives of all people, but especially those who have been marginalized or for centuries perceived as less than or inferior. And so that's kind of the big picture of postcolonial theology. And so when we tie that to mission, postcolonial Christian mission, at least as I am continuing to discern it, is seeking to counter the practices and mindsets that got implemented starting in colonialism. And it seeks to participate in mission through partnership and collaborating with one another, through companionship, through humility, which we can also point out if we are going into a relationship knowing that we need to be humble. Some folks along my journey have helped point out that already means that there's some power at play. We know that we need to humble ourselves. Postcolonial mission encourages us to share power, to share leadership, to be in conversation with one another. It encourages us to listen and to learn from each other. It encourages us to embrace diversity and nuance and context, meaning that things are not always clear, set in stone. What worked today might not work tomorrow, or what works in your house might not work in my house, or it might work, but it might just be that we need to do things differently, and that's okay. And that culture and context and all those different things that make up our lives play a factor, right? So I can't just write the blueprint here for what works in mission at Sardis and then take it across the street or down the street to St. Stephen's, and it'll work exactly the same for them. Postcolonial Christian mission also encourages us to see how we can meet immediate needs, to care for human beings, our fellow human beings, but also to work for long-term solutions. And part of this work then comes up in assessing what is really needed, and then as we're along this journey together, continuing to evaluate and assess our involvement in mission. And so postcolonial mission is both kind of gets us to the ground in our human relationships, but then also pushes us to think about the big picture. Okay, it's not that just that you are hungry today, but why? Why is it that when we get you one meal, the next day, your belly is empty again? So it's looking at those, all those different factors. And what I came across is that a lot of people are applying this way of thinking to a lot of different facets of life in church. Education, worship, all sorts of things. And it has led me to see how those colonized, so to speak, ways of thinking have gotten embedded in so much of what we do here in the church. And so it's worth taking a look at. It's worth thinking about who's in charge here. Does it need to be me? Or do I need to be the supporter to somebody else who is going to take the lead? Am I only thinking about what gifts that I have to share, or am I noticing too the gifts that other people have to share? Am I going into this thinking that, oh, I'll be able to help fix this or come up with the best solution? Am I already going into it with that assumption? Or am I coming to this table where all are invited, no matter what status or place they're coming from, and we're going to figure it out together? It's not easy, challenging. So a couple of key terms that I wanted to share with you that came up in my paper quite a lot. I'll give you the Latin and then also the English. I don't think there's any Latin scholars in here. I'm not one either. In fact, maybe those aren't even Latin, and I don't even know. People have things to teach me still. One of the key terms is the Missio Dei, which means the mission of God. So this is the idea that mission starts with God. It doesn't begin with us or the church. God is the one who is the creator and sender and giver of all life. So we're called to participate in God's mission. It's not ours or the church's. So you have that as one perspective that can influence us and help us discern what Christian mission could and should be. On the other side of the screen, you have the Missio Christi, mission of Christ. This is a particularly Christian perspective that we look to Christ and see how he embodied God's mission. So we see things in Christ like humility, unconditional love, seeking justice and peace, helping to overturn those systems or relationships that were keeping people marginalized or separated. We see this loving desire to be in relationship with fellow human beings and bringing more people to the table. So we have the mission of Christ as inspiration that we can pull from. And then in the middle of the screen, the mission of humanity, which was another concept that I came across in all of this. And this is one that those who write about it, at least first, talk about it as something that can relate to all human beings, no matter your belief system, but that all humans have a responsibility to care for one another, to care for the earth. Then when we combine that with our mission of Christ and mission of God, the mission of humanity is not to take God's place and be a top-down kind of approach, though it is to remember that we are being sent to one another and not the senders. But it is also to pick up on this incarnational model of ministry and mission that Christ embodied for us. So these are three different perspectives that kind of became conversation partners and influencers in my project as I tried to figure out how do we articulate this of what actually is mission and what are we hoping for it to be. Then I also looked into examples of mission in the Bible, and you can see already how this paper is getting very long, very long. God bless my proofreaders and my professor readers. But just to give you a quick summary, we have in creation in the beginning, God creating humankind, and then commissioned to care for and be good stewards of creation and one another. A lot of language and words in the Old Testament about giving special preferential care for the immigrant, for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, taking care of people who don't have every support system that they need. There's acknowledgments that we need to let things rest, including the land, including animals, including human beings who are working. And there is a call to do justice and also to loose the bonds of injustice that are taking place. So not just these new acts of justice, but to try to take apart what is causing injustice. And then once we dig into the New Testament, we have Jesus trying to embody this for us. And I think it's interesting if you think about it, more than just, a Bible verse here and there, some great acts that Jesus did, but how did Jesus actually go about mission? I found it really profound when I continue to remember that he didn't do it by himself either, even though he was God. That he called other people to be a part of it with him, and that mission was enacted in community. When I started putting words to that, it became really powerful for me. And so then I also started to look at the history of Christian mission throughout the course of history. And this is just a very, very broad summary. You have mission that began with the early, at least in terms of Christian mission. Usually when I say mission now, I'm talking about Christian mission. So that begins with the early church, right? God's church is forming people who are trying to follow in Christ-like communities. And they're going out and being missionaries, sharing the good news, creating other communities and places that they go of people who follow and live Christ-like lives. And then fast forward, once you get into the 4th century and afterwards, Christianity, whereas they had been the minority before, they had been persecuted, perhaps killed for being who they were, they came under the umbrella of the emperor and the leaders of the day. And so now all of a sudden Christianity has this new power on its back, and it's able to be connected to all these conquests and things like that going around the world. Now we can force people to be Christian. We can scare you to death to be Christian. And the church begins to see itself as the center of mission. And then we've already mentioned the era of colonialism in the 14th century and that continuing. So we've mentioned that, but interesting too, as we look into this, in the times of colonialism, I think sometimes, at least in my mind before I started reading way too much about this, is that I often try to separate in my brain, okay, you have the colonizers over here, maybe the people who came and took the land from the indigenous people here in the US or in other continents. So they're over here, and then the missionaries were over here. But really, as writers started to point out to us, they're literally on the same boat. They're going together. And all of the actions begin to take on this they're backed by our theology, by our beliefs. And so we have writings like that from people, even from the Pope to a lot of other people, saying, you have the authority to do this. And God and our beliefs are justifying this. So all of that gets really intertwined, and it becomes hard to separate it. And it gets a little scary when we see how people have used scripture to justify those kind of actions. So, very broad summary. Then, here today, I've already mentioned one of the current trends that is an influence on, especially those of us here in the United States context, of short-term mission trips, short-term mission projects. A lot of good, a lot of challenges, a lot of pluses and minuses we could talk about with that. An idea called the experience economy. How many people have ever paid for something to go to an event or something because you're like, this will be a great experience? Yeah, of course. So this notion that kind of gets woven into our consumer society that we're willing to pay for something if it's going to be a good experience, it weaves its way into our practices of Christian mission. I feel like I'm going to get a good experience out of this. Oh yeah, I'll sign up for that mission trip, or I'll participate in this project. And that starts to cover up maybe some of the other reasons which might lead us to participate in mission. And then we have a distinction that I'm going to kind of pit two different terms against each other that I read about, is the idea of a selfie mission, and then the idea of joyful partnership. This is a play on if you take your phone out and take a picture of yourself, you're taking a selfie. And so some writers have talked about this in terms of going into a mission experience, more so looking for how it's going to feel for you. Oh, look what good I have done. Look, everyone on social media, how I have helped other people. And who ends up benefiting the most from that is you and not other people. Now, others might benefit, but the selfie mission really gets twisted to being more about you and your experience and what you get out of it, how you feel about it. And this is something that we encountered in the book study that we did over a year ago, and we had questions about this because we thought, well, are we not supposed to enjoy and find joy in participating in mission? And I have not been able to forget that question that you all raised, because it is a very important one. And so this idea of joyful partnership came up for me in this continued research. And this joyful partnership is not one that is superficial, but one in which we do find joy in partnering with and being in solidarity with one another as we are engaging in mission. And that even while there are hardships going on, there might be things that we are trying to change in the world, there is joy to be experienced among us in the midst, because we're in it together. And as we are participating in mission in ways that we are starting to see hopeful glimpses of how we're getting closer to God's vision for the world, where all have everything that they need, that everyone has, once we see a step towards that peace and justice and wholeness that God wants for us, we find joy. So it's not that this idea of mission, at least how I'm thinking about it right now, is just devoid of happiness and joy, but it's this push to a deeper sense of joy and gratitude as we're on this journey together. So I'm going to pause again before I get into more of the results from the research and the survey that I did amongst you all, and just see if anybody has any questions. So take a moment if you'd like to write one down or put one in the chat. I'll take a few questions, but be mindful that I have some important information with the data that I do want to share with you and get your earnest conversation on. So I may take some questions and then hold some for later. You want to go ahead and voice one, Georgia?
In those three areas, there was that middle one, humanitarian, and it said about top down.
Mm-hmm.
Are they saying top down from God, or are they talking about what kind of top down is that referring to?
So in the mission of humanity idea, I believe that the encouragement is for mission to not be top down, but for it to be incarnational, for it to not be top down. So they kind of, I think it, well, I have to go back and read this stuff a lot more, and I'm sure that my reader who's on this call is laughing at me now, but that is okay. I think it's kind of a pushback and nuance to only saying, well, it's God's mission, you know, kind of, even though we might not imagine God being like a top-down kind of, okay, this is what you're going to do, but it's trying to bring some more nuance into the idea of how we participate in mission.
Could it be more of a not do this for someone?
But we're incarnational, we're in the flesh, in life together, and so we're trying to all care for one another as humans, but still with the humility, I would feel like, of knowing that this is God's mission and not ours. Yeah, there's some kind of overlap, I would say. Yeah. You have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I missed what it was saying on the slide when you talked about eradicating the roots. What do you mean by that?
Eradicating the root causes of an issue. That's a great question. So, for example, if we might say people experience there are a great amount of people experiencing homelessness in the city of Charlotte. Okay, so what is the root cause of that? It might be that its root causes, right? It could be some of that history and how the map of Charlotte has been where people are living and whatnot. It could be systemic things like slavery and civil rights issues that hinder different people from getting to certain economic statuses at the same time. It could be the cost of housing, right? There's all those variables. So root causes is thinking about, okay, what's really at the crux of this? Why are people homelessness? Not just how can I get someone a bed and a meal and a place to be for today, but how do we eliminate them ever being homeless?
And you wanted to say eradicating, E-R.
Perhaps, yes.
The IRR means to actually improve things. And
well.
so you mean just the opposite.
Yes.
So change that.
This is why we're in this together. Yes.
Eradicate.
Yes. So keep writing down those questions as I continue to chat with you all. And I do want to make sure we have some good conversation at the end once I present some of the findings from this research that I did kind of more on the ground here. So again, to remind you that the focus then, after all this nitty-gritty, more academic research, place ourselves back on the ground here at Sardis Presbyterian Church, January 29th. We have this big Sardis Serves Together event that we did with Families Forward. And so beforehand, there were surveys sent out before and after. 2 months later, and there were also focus group conversations that happened. So all of the things that people said, whether it's the quantifiable numbers that people chose, or the freehand answers, or the conversation of those groups, all of that was combined. And I'm trying to give you a high-level summary of what I gleaned from what you all said in regards to these events. If you would like to read the whole summary of all of the data, I would love to share it with you and be more than willing to. Just don't have that much time. So the highest level summary I can give you is that comparing before and after what people said when they were asked, what is Christian mission? What does it mean? How are you called, if at all, to reimagine how we're practicing and understanding mission? When I took a broad summary of all of the data, both words and quantifiable numbers, 93% of people who filled out the survey, which was over 100 people here at Sardis, said that the Sardis Serves Together event in January led them to consider adapting or maybe reimagining their mission actions or practices. And then almost exactly the same amount, 92% of people who filled out the survey before and after said in some way they were led to think about mission differently. So those are pretty interesting statistics. Now, some, I will note, some said, this event just confirmed what I already thought. Some said I didn't have a change at all. So there was across the spectrum, but it also, I think that shows that all of us, one, we're coming from different places, but also we weren't starting from ground zero. This is a congregation who's been involved in thinking and intentionally acting in mission for a long time. So It's not that we were all starting from being completely unaware of Christian mission and what we thought about it. So I'll share with you a couple of the responses that I found to be meaningful. One of the questions that I ask people is, what is Christian mission and what is its purpose? Beforehand, I would say that overall, most of the answers, or a majority of the answers, were a bit more general. Showing God's love through actions, being the hands and feet of Christ, helping others in need. Those are kind of the summarized. A lot of answers fit into those categories. It was shared, mission is using my resources and gifts to help others. However, there were not very many mentions of words like collaboration and partnership, and a very small emphasis from maybe a few people on looking at the gifts or leadership of other people, perhaps those in need, or needing to assess the effects or sustainability of the mission that we were doing. It's not to say that they didn't appear beforehand, but it was just not as common. So afterwards, we did see a pretty significant shift, specifically to more specific descriptions of what people thought Christian mission is and what its purpose was. And there were a lot more words like sustainability, partnership, working together, empowering, working towards long-term change. A lot more of that language being used to describe what Christian mission is. And I think I'll get to it in a moment, what I think we have to thank for that, but I also will give a shout out and thanks to our mission partner that we partnered with, Families Forward Charlotte, who that's what they do. And so I think we picked up on that. I also saw some trends of mission being described as an act of the community, or as an act that when we're doing mission, we want to build relationships too. And we want to make sure that we are empowering or equipping others to perhaps even meet their own needs, to keep those going. So this question I found very interesting, your responses. What questions do you ask before you participate in mission? So people were asked that before, and then afterwards, okay, if you were going to ask a question before you go into donating something or participating in a project again, what are you going to ask? Before and after, people wondered about some similar things. What impact is this going to have? And then also, how is the money or the service or the donation going to be used? Particularly, I think people were thinking of, if I'm giving this donation to so-and-so, to this organization, how is it being used? How is that money divided up and how the organization uses it? So a lot of questions of those before and after. But again, similar to the first question, a lot of the responses were fairly general. And so I'll jump to the after responses. And these are direct quotes from some of our participants. What questions are you going to ask now when you're getting ready to participate in mission? Now, not just saying, how is it going to impact others, but saying, how will it positively impact others or make a true difference in someone else's life? How will my actions affect the receiver? Will it be a temporary Band-Aid or a long-lasting effect? Will my donation do any unforeseen harm? How does this empower others? How does this provide both relief and maybe help solve the problem? Does this foster any dependency? Does this help someone else work towards self-sufficiency? So a lot of really thoughtful, detailed questions that people said they wanted to think about the next time they go about engaging in mission. And I think both the question I shared with you before and this one really show a shift amongst the participants in this way of post-colonial thinking. So that to me was pretty impactful. Another question that I asked folks was, what perspectives are most important, do you think, for us to embody when we engage in mission? And I'm going to go over a very brief very briefly this chart with you. This is one where they were given choices and you had to sort it and make an order and make some hard decisions. But what perspectives are most important for us? Beforehand, the majority of folks said, well, it's important that mission uses my resources and gifts to help others. And then you see the numbers kind of fluctuate and even out in the after responses. And the most common top choice afterwards became working together as partners with those in need. So that shows an interesting shift in just in terms of perspectives. Which one, would you have put at the very top? This is the most important. Beforehand, the most important was using my resources to help others. Afterwards, that changed to working as partners with those in need. And then one of the last questions that people were asked is, how is God calling you to reimagine how you understand or practice Christian mission, if at all? Not assuming that people experience that. So again, I found this breakdown to be kind of interesting, and that it stayed, the numbers, how I categorize people's responses kind of stayed the same. A lot of people talked about reimagining how they want to be involved, whether that was more or in a different way. So that was a pretty strong common theme. Another common theme was continuing to reimagine how we're practicing, or especially how we're learning and understanding what mission is. So those categories stayed pretty much the same, but again, like some of the other questions, I found very powerful people's responses. And these are some examples and summaries of what people said afterwards. Talked about prayerfully considering and discerning our involvement. So maybe not just wanting, I want to be more involved, I want to do more mission, to I want to prayerfully consider and be intentional about how I'm engaging in mission. I'll say that the study didn't really show if people would change the types of activities of mission that they wanted to do. There's a lot that really couldn't be accounted for in terms of age and stage of life, of however you would have answered the questions before and then where you are in your life now. So we didn't really get any kind of good picture about that, just because of all of the details of people's lives. But we did see people asking, I think, more detailed, really thoughtful questions, and hoping to say, for instance, act as equal, not as superior to those receiving assistance. Seeking to build more relationships as we go forward in mission. One person talked about trying to take on less the idea of helping or serving, and more the idea of coming alongside, maybe with resources, but also intentional care. This idea of building bridges and relationships through mutual trust and respect. Really powerful stuff. So one other piece of this research that I did was I asked our mission partners, what do you think? And the reason why I did this, one, was because I was trying to embody the whole post-colonial thing. We're not just going to ask ourselves what we think. We want to know what other people think. And so I did get responses from 4 of our local mission partners. I did not ask any of our international partners because this study focused on a local mission event that, partner that we did. So focus just on inviting those who are in our community that we work with to respond. And so we have responses from Rainbow Road Elementary School, Charlotte Rescue Mission, Families Forward Charlotte, and then Friendship Trays Loaves and Fishes. And they had a lot of positive things to say about volunteer involvement, both of Sardis volunteers and other volunteers, especially when they sense that volunteers are listening to what the needs are and then acting accordingly. And I noticed in the questions and how they answer them that a lot of our organizations and partners that we work with, they embody a lot of these post-colonial mission mindsets and practices that that I was looking into. So that was a great thing to find. They noted, they were asking, what challenges do you encounter when you're working with volunteers, such as those at Sardis? And they talked about the challenge of gifts and donations that come without accountability. They lifted up a challenge of volunteers who are trying to fix things, or sometimes volunteers who make hurtful or harmful comments. Others lifted up challenges of partners who don't embrace the mutual partnership between like what they and their community is trying to do. And then there was one who lifted up a challenge that some churches have adopted so many different partnerships that they can't really make an impact and a significant impact in with any one partner. So I appreciated them being candid with us. And again, that wasn't just talking about, they might have been particularly thinking about Sardis, but they were also asked to think, more broadly about all of their volunteers. They gave us some ideas about reimagining mission, one of which was regular, consistent, in-depth volunteers, more personal relationships, and we can feel some of that joyful partnership feelings, because a lot of folks that answered this expressed how Sardis is already, involved in such a way with wonderful relationships and understanding and listening and involvement. So a lot of good things came from what they shared. Now, they were also invited to see if anybody who we might call a recipient of their services would be willing to fill out an anonymous survey. I knew that was going to be a challenge, but again, trying to think post-colonially, that is one perspective that we hear very little from, is those who might be, participating in the family school program, or a parent at Raymond Road Elementary School, or getting that friendship trays or Loaves and Fishes food box. So we tried, and we got one response. And part of this could be that even with an anonymous thing, organizations may not have felt comfortable or had somebody they wanted to ask who would fill this out. And they were offered to fill it out, in a conversation or written, whichever way. But we did get one response from what we'll call a recipient who happened to have benefited from multiple of these organizations. And so while that person's response cannot be considered a broad generalization of all of these, I did want to lift up that person's response and say that person, when asked, given a lot of different choices, said they felt heard and felt like a friend and a partner with these organizations, and that they were given opportunities to make decisions and have opinions. So at least from one person's perspective, we can see how post-colonial methods of mission are being interacted in our community, which I think is really great. So now what? You may be wondering. Now what? What does this mean for us? So this is the last part of information that I'll share with you, and then I'm hoping to hear back from you. How does this resonate with you personally, as a member of the Sardis community, or even the wider community and body of Christ? So from all of this data and research and all the things, I tried to ask that question. Okay, like what does this mean for us, right? We know it's not going to change everything overnight, but where are we being led? And some powerful shifts that I saw in y'all's responses is that I noticed this shift in theology and how we're understanding what Christian mission is. Moving from something that might be more general, helping others, towards embodying God's love, an example of Christ through partnership, through very specific actions and interactions. And actions that might lead us not to just put a Band-Aid on something, but lead towards sustainable change. I noticed a big shift in our way of thinking of mission as sharing our blessings with others, towards mission as empowering and equipping others, and can involve me sharing my resources, or what you might call blessings, with others. That's a piece of it. But there's a shift. You can see that shift in our way of thinking. And again, these are y'all's thoughts and not mine. Shifts in thinking of, when I participate in mission, I'm certain that I know what is going to be helpful. And a shift towards curiosity and questions. Okay, we need to learn and consider how, what is needed and what will be helpful. Another shift that I noticed was, anything that I do, as long as I have a good heart about it, it's going to be good. Towards, acts of service we can all acknowledge. It could cause harm, it could cause good. So just knowing that is a different way of understanding how we participate in Christian mission. The way we see ourselves, who we believe ourselves to be as we're participating in mission, I noticed a shift in that. Not just seeing ourselves as the giver and the helper, but this shift towards seeing ourselves as partners, not as the saviors. And maybe we didn't think we were the saviors to begin with, but those things can get embedded in us. Seeing ourselves as partners. We have something we can give. We have something we can receive. And then lastly, this is a powerful shift that I took away from responses, is that mission is less of a task that we need to complete and finish, but more of this lifelong, it's a way of life that we are a part of, that we are adopting, and always in the process of discovering, perhaps adapting, and being a part of. So I wanted to know, though, okay, great, we saw these results, so to speak, but what led to those results? And there were a lot of different facets of this Sort of Serves Together day. And people were asked, what were the most impactful elements of this day? And by far, the most common answer for the most impactful element of this day was the educational activities and time that we spent with Families Forward Charlotte, where folks learned about the complexities of poverty. They had discussion and learned from a personal story from Families Forward. This learning that took place before we did the hands-on project was the number one thing that people said impacted them. So I think that's important. And then the second most important thing that people said impacted them was worship. Both the sermon and then the experience of worship, which we had before we took part in the educational time. And I want to believe that this wasn't just because we decided to worship because that's what we do on Sundays, but because we were also very intentional about what made up that worship service. You may not have realized it then, but I hope when I give you some of these examples, you'll realize maybe how we were from the underside trying to be intentionally post-colonial and how worship ended up that day. You didn't have just me and Joby over here leading everything, but we had people of all ages intentionally invited to lead and participate in the service, to lead the music, to read, to teach. We shared the pulpit with people from Families Forward. It was a community-led worship service. And then we were also intentional in how we engaged with Scripture in a way that we could help us understand this different way of thinking. So you can see some of the other options. I just wanted to show you some of the other options that people were given. Try to include every element of the day. And apparently because of the screen, there we go, the numbers. So you see the educational and the worship things were the most impactful. And I thought it was thought-provoking that one of you said, I think this day illustrates that what we want as a community, that we want community and gatherings with purpose. People felt there was a lot of purpose and intentionality throughout the day, and someone lifted up, This is what we want. We want community and gatherings with purpose. Others shared how much they learned about postcolonialism and all those other things. And so I think the intentionality, not just in how we did the service project, but how we led up to it, to me, seems like it really impacted people. And I'm thankful for all the people who were part of that. And then I'll share just one other quote from a Sardis Serves Together participant that I thought was really impactful. They said, "It's way more than writing a check. It's about developing relationships with those being served. It's about not enabling generational poverty. It's about making sure our good intentions don't overpower the ways that those in need might be able to learn to provide for themselves. It's about commitment and being able and understanding that things are not, nor will ever be, quick fixes. It's about remembering first to pray for God's blessing, guidance, and direction before just rushing in to do something and causing more harm than good." Again, those are y'all's words and not mine. So again, we see these shifts in belief and understanding, but what does that mean for us practically? And this is the last piece that I'll run through somewhat quickly so I can see what you all think, especially in terms of these 5 practical shifts that I started to notice. How do these resonate with you and with us as a community? So 5 practical shifts, as I'll call them, that this data might recommend for us to consider as we practice mission here at Sardis. First is patience and intentionality. I know we all really like the quick fixes, but it's just, yeah, we have to resist that. And being intentional, that's something that people really took away from this. So being intentional in how we practice mission. The second practical thing, and maybe possible tip for us, is examining our motivations, how we're going into this, right? And continuing to check ourselves, right? I still find myself needing to do that. And then looking at the results, whether that be at the very end of a project or somebody voiced, how do we know if this actually made an impact? That's a great question to not let go of, and to actually ask and perhaps seek out the conversation that can maybe help us learn more about that. The third practical shift was worship and education, implementing worship and education as a part of our mission practices. So how is our worship every Sunday influencing us to how to go out into the world and how we practice mission? It's going to influence us one way or another. So the intentional ways perhaps that we are speaking or participating in worship, the topics we explore, they're gonna influence us one way or another. But what practically showed up in this project is that when we're intentional about it, we come in with certain things we're trying to help emphasize, it makes a really big impact. Number 4 is discernment. This is a hard one, because it means we also have to slow down and think and try to figure out answers that we might not have the answers to. So there are a lot of questions I came away with that we could be or maybe should be asking ourselves. And there's a lot more than even I put on the screen here, which can feel kind of overwhelming, but there are just various discernment questions that we can be asking ourselves. Like, is this fostering empowerment? Are we doing this mission because we feel like we should, or we feel like we always have, or because God has called us to take part in this mission? Do we need to adjust or expand or fine-tune or focus how we're participating in mission? How can we help solve, or how can we help meet immediate needs and also help solve the problem? These are not questions that my project necessarily gave us the answers to, but as I think have encouraged us to ask. I'm gonna skip ahead to the last one. So the last practical shift that I think this recommends is to expand our mission beyond just on-campus events. So in these pictures, you have an example of an on-campus mission activity. You have, actually, you can't see it quite in the picture, but there are 3 generations gathered here together, making beds here in the Sardis house for our Room in the Inn neighbors. This is a really impactful and important way to engage in mission. Because not only is it forming our youngest and engaging people together, it's making a significant impact on those who will have a warm place to sleep. This is something that we should not get rid of, right? But also expanding beyond things that happen here, take us out into the world to witness the ways in which God's love and light are at work in other people that we might not come across when we're just here making the beds before our neighbors come. So you have a picture here of some of our church members, adults and children, I think at least three generations gathered in this photo too, at Families Forward Charlotte. While the parents were having an educational workshop, some of our members spent time with the children, playing games and doing crafts and eating and sharing a meal together. That's really impactful and important mission too. So it's not to say that it's one or the other, but that it is important, given where we are in Charlotte, given the history of Christian mission and all these other things, that we break out of our bubble, so to speak, and engage in God's mission in the world. Because there are powerful, as one author calls it, Eucharistic moments that happen that are not in the sanctuary, that might happen over a slice of pizza, that might happen as you're helping with the bouncy house at the Rhema Fall Fest or something like that. There are powerful Eucharistic moments where we experience our connections and belovedness and brokenness as the body of God's people all over the place. And so I think part of what we are called to do is not limit the ways in which that we take part in that and witness that in the world. So the last thing I would love for, is to ask you this. How do these practical shifts resonate with you, or what questions or ideas do they raise? Okay, I would like for you to take just a moment before we wrap up and talk about that at your table. Perhaps write down your thoughts, put them in the comments. You may not want to share them with the whole group, but would love to have at least something from a few of you or each table. So turn to your table, or if you would like to reflect on your own, answer these questions. How do these practical shifts resonate with you? Implementing possibly some of these shifts in our mission practices. What questions or ideas do they bring up for you?
Your money water for that, figure it out. You don't even know.
Sounds like, at least for those in the room, there's been a lot of thoughts to share. If someone at each table would be willing to even just write down a couple of the thoughts or questions that you all raised, I would love to take that with me. Technically, you all have an input on the final status of this project. And, or if you have one that you want to write down yourself, I'd appreciate a little bit of insight and reflection from each of our tables. And again, if you're online, you're welcome to put a question or something you thought about in the chat. Anybody want to share one thing from their table of how this resonated with you, and/or a question or idea that you talked about? Anna?
Well, first just really wanted to thank you for bringing this conversation here. I think that, like, I've always been really uncomfortable and haven't really participated in secret commissions because I really, like, always kind of felt that colonial power dynamic, and, like, the word mission even seemed to, like, center me. And so I just really excited and grateful that you're bringing this discussion about, like, post-colonial relationships here, and, like, that it's really a focus on community and And I think our table started jumping into like, okay, let's evaluate the specific partnerships we have. Like, is this really helping, or not helping, but is this really a partnership? And so I think, like, I just really appreciate you starting the conversation. I think it's really great for the church.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being a part of the conversation. So Hannah mentioned some feelings of uncomfortableness with participating in Christian mission in the past because of a sense she felt from the power dynamics at play. And so appreciation for a shift of thinking in terms of seeing ourselves as partners and working together. And then sounds like some practical, perhaps specific, maybe, I don't know if it's activities or partnerships of things that maybe, oh, maybe we could look into this, and maybe we could look into this. So things like that. Thank you. Anybody else share? I'll send my assistant in the blue shirt around to collect any other thoughts, questions, ideas from the table. And if you think of something later, you're more than welcome to send that to me.
I just want to.
Yes.
I want to share an experience, which perhaps emphasizes the need for partnership in missions instead of this top-down thing that you're talking about. Of course, I realize that this top-down thing might apply when we think of mission in relation to God and us. But when it comes to we humans in mission, then there's nothing like top-down. We have all the answers. We're going to dump them on the people. That is where the partnership comes in. And I have a very good experience in Ghana. I was in charge of a presbytery of 26 districts called Achem Ewakwa Presbytery. And we had some partners in Germany, the Allen Church District of Germany. They were supporting us with ecological concerns. We're planting trees and so on. That was the main concern. At a point, we wanted to incorporate economic empowerment into the project. So I wrote a proposal to them for us to nurse oil palm seedlings and distribute them free of charge to our members to plant their own oil palm plantation, so that after 4 years, when they begin to harvest them, they would enjoy the benefits and help their families to have improved economic life. So we wrote this to them. They accepted. Actually, after they had asked a whole lot of questions, we answered them. And so now the planting of trees is going on alongside this economic empowerment project where we supply oil palm seedlings free of charge to our members. And I think it is a good example of this partnership. They are helping our people, but they are also ready to listen and to incorporate some of our concerns into the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to finish with a prayer. And again, want to encourage anybody who would like to talk afterwards or send me thoughts or even schedule a conversation for later. Definitely what I've come away with from this project is that it's ongoing. It's a lifelong journey, not something that I've come away with all the answers to, nor have found anybody else, at least yet, who has all of the answers either. But that we're all, in this together. And so I appreciate each of you taking the time to be here, to be some of those mission co-workers alongside of us. So I just really appreciate you giving this a listen and us continue to be in conversation of how we go forward together. So I wanted to close with a prayer, and this prayer is actually a compilation of words from the Sardis community. Not in the immediately following survey, but For those who filled out the survey that was sent out several months later, one of the last questions people were asked is, what is your prayer for Sardis's engagement in God's mission going forward? So I took all of those prayers that all of the 50, 60, 70 some individuals put, and I combined it into one prayer. So I thought, and this is an example again of how we're still learning, because I was like, oh, I have this great prayer that I wrote that I could share, and it's like perfect for this occasion. And I had that all in my presentation, and then I said, what are you thinking? You already asked the people what they want to pray for, and you already combined their words. So you see, we still have to just check ourselves and continue to think. It doesn't need to be the pastors praying all the time. So let me offer this prayer. God, I pray that this new awareness of God's mission will move Sardis members to become servants to others, that this awareness leads to action and not to complacency. I pray that we continue to engage and form partnerships that everyone finds a mission to be involved with, and that we continue to learn more about the needs around us. I pray that we will focus our support and get at least half of our congregation involved. I pray for mission to mutually benefit our partners and the Sardis community. I pray that Sardis's involvement in mission will help us to grow as a church family and encourage us to reach out and invite more people into different activities. As a community of faith, I pray we are able to stretch and grow and invest our time and energy in caring for God's people and world. And that as we do, that we get to know and connect with more of our church members and neighbors. I pray for and wish for our efforts to make long-lasting impacts and to be able to be measured for their effectiveness. I pray that we will be a church who is open to listening to the changing needs in our community and beyond. I pray that we will listen to what will actually help and not what we think will help. I pray that we can provide real support and not take on more than our congregation can support. I pray to be accepting and non-judgmental, that Sardis will continue to keep mission as a focus, educating our membership on the change in mission and the importance that change in creating an enthusiasm for mission work. I pray that as we continue to participate in global mission, that we will make a meaningful impact on our local neighbors. We pray that we will follow Jesus's example, serving with compassion and acceptance of all God's people, and model this for our children. We pray for God to guide us in choosing the ways we spend our time, our money, and our talents. May we reflect the hands and feet and heart of Christ as we engage in mission work and see all people as Christ sees them. God, help us to all find our path to support missions in whatever each individual is called to serve. Keep us safe and help us to share your love. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you all for coming.